came to the cafe expecting answers, but left with more questions, and a warning that would change everything. Who followed him inside, and why? What begins as a simple meeting unravels into a deadly mystery. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The rain fell in heavy sheets across the cobblestone streets of Boston, turning the late afternoon of March 1895 into a canvas of gray and silver. The gas lamps had been lit early, their warm glow reflecting off the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. Inside the Westbrook Café, a modest establishment tucked between a haberdashery and a bookshop on Beacon Street, the atmosphere was thick with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm bread, a welcome refuge from the bitter cold outside. Alexander Thorne sat alone at a corner table, his tall frame folded elegantly into the wooden chair, his dark overcoat draped over the seat beside him. At 32 years of age, he cut an impressive figure, broad-shouldered and strongly built, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing and dark hair that fell just slightly over his forehead. His face was handsome in a severe way, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones that spoke of old Boston money, which indeed ran through his veins. But Alexander was no idle gentleman. He had made his fortune not through inheritance alone, but through his brilliant mind and his unconventional profession. He was a private detective, one of the most sought after in New England, known for solving cases that left the police baffled. He stirred his coffee absently, his mind occupied with the letter he had received that morning. The handwriting had been elegant but hurried, the words cryptic. Mr. Thorne, I require your assistance in a matter of utmost delicacy. Someone is watching me, and I fear for what they might discover. Please come to the Westbrook Café at 4 o'clock this afternoon. I shall explain everything. V.M. Alexander had arrived precisely at 4, as was his habit. Punctuality was a virtue he prized highly. Now, 15 minutes past the appointed hour, his mysterious correspondent had yet to appear. He was beginning to wonder if this was some elaborate hoax when the door to the cafe opened, admitting a gust of cold wind and rain along with a new patron. She entered like a vision from another world, though she was very much of this one. Victoria Marlowe was 28 years old, and she possessed the kind of beauty that made men forget their own names. Her auburn hair was pinned up beneath a navy blue hat adorned with a single white feather, though several damp tendrils had escaped to frame her face. Her eyes were a striking shade of green, intelligent and alert, set in a face that combined delicacy with determination. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, modest yet perfectly tailored to her slender figure, and carried a small leather satchel clutched tightly in her gloved hands. Victoria's gaze swept the cafe quickly, efficiently, until it landed on Alexander. Recognition flickered in her eyes, though they had never met. She had seen his photograph in the newspapers often enough, the famous millionaire detective who solved the Whitmore kidnapping last year, who had exposed the counterfeit ring operating out of the harbor. She moved toward his table with graceful steps, though Alexander noticed the slight tremor in her movements, the way her eyes darted toward the door behind her. Mr. Thorne? Her voice was soft but clear, with the cultured accent of someone educated in the finest schools. Alexander rose immediately, his manners impeccable despite his unorthodox profession. Miss Marlowe, I presume? Yes. She glanced around nervously before taking the seat he offered. Thank you for coming. I wasn't certain you would take my request seriously. Any request made with such urgency demands attention, Alexander replied, resuming his seat. He studied her face carefully, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw. You mentioned that someone is watching you. Has there been a specific incident? Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment the door opened again. A man entered, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, rain dripping from his long coat. He was of average height and build, unremarkable in every way, which was precisely what made Alexander's instincts sharpen. The man took a seat near the window, far enough away to avoid obvious suspicion, close enough to observe. Victoria had gone pale. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cup of tea the waitress brought her. The waitress was a young woman named Grace, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She had worked at the Westbrook Café for 3 years, and knew most of the regular customers by name, though she had never seen either Alexander or Victoria before today. Is everything all right, miss? Grace asked quietly, noting Victoria's distress. Yes, thank you, Victoria managed, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Grace nodded and moved away, but Alexander saw her glance toward the man by the window, her brow furrowing slightly. She was observant, this waitress. That was good. Tell me everything, Alexander said in a low voice, leaning forward slightly. When did this begin? Victoria took a shaky breath, composing herself with visible effort. 3 weeks ago. I returned to Boston after 2 years in Europe. I was studying art history in Paris and Rome. My uncle Edmund Marlowe had passed away, and I was named in his will. He left me his estate, including his house on Commonwealth Avenue and other items. What sort of items? Alexander's gray eyes were intent on her face. Documents. Letters. My uncle was a historian, Mr. Thorne, specializing in the Revolutionary War period. He had spent 40 years collecting correspondence, journals, maps, anything related to that era. But shortly before his death, he wrote to me saying he had discovered something extraordinary, something that would rewrite what we know about the founding of this nation. Those were his exact words. Alexander felt the familiar stirring of interest that came with a genuine mystery. And these documents, do you have them? Some of them. They were stored in a private vault at the house. But when I arrived and had the vault opened, I discovered that several items were missing. My uncle's lawyer, Mr. Whitfield, insists that nothing was removed after Uncle Edmund's death, that the vault had remained sealed. Yet I know my uncle's cataloging system. He was meticulous, and at least a dozen items from his collection are gone. You believe they were stolen before his death? I don't know what to believe. But Mr. Thorne, my uncle died under strange circumstances. He was found at the bottom of the stairs in his home. The doctor ruled it an accidental fall, but Uncle Edmund was only 65, in perfect health, and those stairs were ones he had climbed thousands of times. And now someone is following me. Everywhere I go, there is someone watching. Different people, different faces, but always there. At the market, at the bank, even at church on Sunday. Alexander's expression remained calm, but his mind was racing through possibilities. Have you approached the police? Victoria's laugh was bitter. I tried. They were polite but dismissive. They said my uncle's death was investigated thoroughly and found to be accidental. As for being followed, they suggested I was merely imagining things, that grief can play tricks on the mind. A woman's hysteria, they implied, though they were too polite to use those words. And the missing documents? They said perhaps my uncle sold them or gave them away before his death, that I couldn't be certain of what should be there since I had been away for 2 years. They all but patted me on the head and sent me home. The frustration in her voice was evident, and Alexander found himself admiring her spirit. She had every right to be angry. I will help you, Miss Marlowe, Alexander said firmly, but I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? Victoria met his gaze, and something passed between them in that moment. A connection, a mutual understanding. She saw in his eyes intelligence and determination, and something else too, something that made her heart skip unexpectedly. He saw in hers courage and honesty, and a vulnerability that stirred something protective within him. Yes, she said simply, I can trust you. At that moment, Grace returned to their table, moving quickly. She bent down as if to wipe the table, and as she did so, she slipped a folded piece of paper beneath Alexander's coffee cup. Her voice was barely audible. Don't react. Read it quietly. Then she was gone, moving back toward the kitchen with her cloth and tray. Alexander waited a moment before carefully retrieving the note. He unfolded it beneath the table, keeping his expression neutral as he read the words written in a hasty but clear hand. Someone followed you inside. Stay calm. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked up at Victoria, then allowed his gaze to drift casually around the café. The man by the window was still there, but now Alexander noticed another figure, a woman in a dark cloak seated near the door, ostensibly reading a newspaper. Too still, too focused on not appearing to focus. Miss Marlowe, Alexander said calmly, I think we should continue this conversation elsewhere. My townhouse is not far from here. We can speak more freely there. Victoria nodded, understanding the urgency in his tone despite his careful composure. Of course. As they prepared to leave, Alexander caught Grace's eye and gave her a small nod of thanks. She acknowledged it with the briefest smile before disappearing into the kitchen. He made a mental note of her quick thinking and discretion, qualities that might prove useful in the days ahead. They rose together, and Alexander helped Victoria with her coat, a gesture that brought them momentarily close. He caught the faint scent of lavender from her hair and felt her slight tremor as his hands briefly touched her shoulders. She looked up at him, and their eyes met again, holding for just a moment longer than necessary. Something unspoken passed between them, something neither was quite ready to acknowledge, but both felt nonetheless. The rain had intensified when they stepped outside, the wind whipping it sideways down the street. Alexander immediately hailed a hansom cab, helping Victoria up into it with a firm, steady hand. As the driver urged the horse forward into the storm, Alexander glanced back at the café. Both the man by the window and the woman by the door had emerged, standing on the sidewalk, watching their departure with undisguised interest. The game, it seemed, had truly begun. The hansom cab clattered through the rain-soaked streets of Boston, the horse's hooves splashing through puddles that reflected the dim glow of gas lamps. Inside, Alexander and Victoria sat in tense silence, both acutely aware of the danger that seemed to follow them like a shadow. Alexander kept his gaze fixed on the street behind them, watching for any sign of pursuit, while Victoria clutched her leather satchel as though it contained the secrets of the universe itself. "We're being followed," Alexander said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain hammering against the cab's roof. "Don't look back. There's a carriage keeping pace with us, staying just far enough behind to avoid obvious detection." Victoria's fingers tightened on her satchel. "What do we do?" "We improvise." Alexander leaned forward and called up to the driver. "Take us to the Old North Church, quickly. There's an extra $1 in it for you if you can lose anyone following us." The driver, a weathered man who had seen enough of Boston's streets to know when not to ask questions, cracked his whip with enthusiasm. "Hold tight, sir." The cab lurched forward, picking up speed as it turned sharply down a narrow side street. Victoria was thrown against Alexander's solid frame, and his arm instinctively went around her shoulders to steady her. For a moment, they were pressed close together, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through their layers of wet clothing, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. The moment stretched, both of them suddenly aware of something beyond the immediate danger, an attraction that was as unexpected as it was undeniable. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, his voice lower than before, his face inches from hers. "Yes," Victoria whispered, though she made no move to pull away. "Thank you." The cab swerved again, breaking the spell, and they separated, both slightly flustered. Through the rain-streaked window, Alexander could see that the pursuing carriage had fallen back, unable to navigate the narrow streets with the same agility as their smaller hansom. "We've lost them," Alexander announced with satisfaction, "but we'll still take precautions. Driver, continue to the church, but then circle around to Marlborough Street, number 47. 20 minutes later, after a circuitous route designed to shake off any remaining pursuit, the cab pulled up in front of an elegant brownstone townhouse. Alexander's residence was exactly what one might expect of a wealthy bachelor, refined but not ostentatious, with tall windows and a black iron fence. He helped Victoria down from the cab, his hand lingering in hers perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, and quickly ushered her up the steps and through the front door. The interior of the townhouse was warm and welcoming after the cold rain outside. A fire burned in the drawing-room fireplace, and the walls were lined with bookshelves that reached nearly to the ceiling. Maps and charts were pinned to various surfaces, and a large oak desk in the corner was covered with papers and correspondence. It was clearly the home of a man whose mind was always working, always piecing together puzzles. "Please sit by the fire," Alexander said, helping Victoria out of her wet coat. "I'll have my housekeeper bring us some hot tea." "Mrs. Fletcher," he called. An older woman appeared from the back of the house, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her expression one of practiced efficiency mixed with genuine warmth. "Yes, Mr. Thorne?" "Tea for two, please, Mrs. Fletcher, and perhaps some of those biscuits you made this morning." "Right away, sir." Mrs. Fletcher's keen eyes took in Victoria's bedraggled state with sympathy before she bustled away. Alexander removed his own coat and moved to stoke the fire, building it higher. Then he pulled up a chair close to where Victoria sat, close enough that their knees nearly touched. The intimacy of the setting was not lost on either of them, but the urgency of their situation overrode any concerns about propriety. "Now," Alexander said, his gray eyes intense in the firelight, "tell me everything about these documents your uncle discovered. What exactly did his letter say? Victoria opened her satchel with trembling fingers and withdrew a folded letter, its edges worn from repeated readings. This arrived 2 weeks before he died. I was still in Rome when I received it. Alexander took the letter carefully, unfolding it to reveal a spidery but elegant handwriting. He read aloud, "My dearest Victoria, I write to you with news that will astound you as it has astounded me. In the course of my research, I have uncovered correspondence between certain founding fathers that reveals a secret pact made during the Revolutionary War, a pact that, if made public, would fundamentally alter our understanding of how our nation came to be. I dare not commit the details to paper, for I believe I am being watched. These documents are too dangerous, too valuable. I have taken measures to protect them, but should anything happen to me, you must find them and decide what is to be done. Trust no one, my dear girl. The truth is more complicated than anyone knows, and there are those who would kill to keep it buried. Your loving uncle, Edmund." A heavy silence fell over the room as Alexander finished reading. He looked up at Victoria, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes. "Did he give you any hint as to where he might have hidden these documents?" "None. The letter was the last communication I had from him. By the time I received word of his death and could arrange passage back to Boston, 2 weeks had passed. When I arrived at his house and had the vault opened, I found his collection in disarray. Someone had been through it, but whether before or after his death I cannot say. And the items that remain, are they significant? Some are valuable to collectors and historians, certainly. Letters from John Adams, a journal kept by a Continental Army officer, maps of Boston during the siege. But nothing that matches what my uncle described. No pact, no secret correspondence that would shake the foundations of our national history." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Your uncle was a careful man, you said. Meticulous. If he knew he was in danger, he wouldn't have left these documents in an obvious place. He would have hidden them somewhere only you could find them. But how? He gave me no clue, no instructions. Perhaps he did, but in a way that wouldn't be obvious to anyone else. Think, Miss Marlowe. In his letter, in his previous correspondence with you, in your childhood memories of him, was there anything special between you? A private joke? A favorite place? A shared secret?" Victoria closed her eyes, thinking back through years of memories. Her Uncle Edmund had been like a father to her after her own parents died in a carriage accident when she was 10 years old. He had raised her, educated her, encouraged her love of history and art. They had spent countless hours in his library, poring over old documents and discussing the past as though it were as alive and vibrant as the present. "He used to tell me stories," she said slowly, her eyes still closed. "When I was a child, before bed, he would tell me stories about the Revolution. Not the sanitized versions from textbooks, but real stories, complicated stories about real people, with real flaws and real courage. His favorite was about a secret meeting that supposedly took place in 1778, in a tavern cellar somewhere in Boston. He said it was where the true course of the war was decided, where compromises were made that saved the revolution but bound us to consequences we're still living with today." Alexander's interest sharpened. "Did he ever tell you where this tavern was?" "He said it didn't exist anymore, that it had been torn down decades ago, but he always spoke about it with such conviction, as though he knew it had really happened. He called it the Midnight Convocation." "The Midnight Convocation," Alexander repeated, committing the name to memory. "That could be significant. Is there anything else? Any other detail, no matter how small?" Before Victoria could answer, Mrs. Fletcher returned with a tray bearing a steaming teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of buttered biscuits. She set it down on the small table between them with a knowing smile. "There you are, Mr. Thorne. The tea should warm you both up nicely. It's a dreadful night out there." "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. That will be all for now." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, though not before casting one more curious glance at Victoria. It wasn't often that Mr. Thorne brought young ladies to his home, and never in such dramatic circumstances. Alexander poured the tea himself, his movements precise and elegant. He handed a cup to Victoria, their fingers brushing as she took it. Again, that spark of connection, that awareness of each other that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. "Drink," he said gently. "You're still shivering." Victoria obeyed, grateful for the warmth spreading through her as she sipped the hot tea. She watched Alexander over the rim of her cup, studying him properly for the first time since they'd met. He was extraordinarily handsome, she realized, though it was a severe, intellectual kind of handsomeness, rather than the soft, pretty looks of the gentleman who had courted her in Paris. There was strength in every line of his face, intelligence in those penetrating gray eyes, and something else, a loneliness perhaps, or a weariness that came from seeing too much of the darkness in human nature. "Mr. Thorne," she began, then hesitated. "Please, call me Alexander. Given the circumstances, I think we can dispense with excessive formality." "Alexander," she said, testing the name on her lips and finding she liked the sound of it. "Why do you do this?" "You're wealthy enough that you need never work a day in your life. Why risk yourself as a detective?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost distant. "Because I cannot abide injustice. Because I have seen too many people suffer because the truth was buried, because the powerful protected their interests at the expense of the innocent. My father taught me that wealth brings responsibility, that those who have much must do much. This is how I choose to fulfill that responsibility, by finding truth in a world full of lies, by giving voice to those who cannot speak for themselves." Victoria felt her heart constrict at his words. Here was a man who could have lived a life of idle luxury, but instead chose to spend his days pursuing justice for strangers. "That's very noble," she said softly. Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, and what he saw took his breath away. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was intelligence in her eyes, courage in the set of her jaw, and a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being. In that moment, he realized that this case was already different from all the others. It wasn't just about solving a mystery anymore. It was about protecting this woman, about ensuring her safety, and about something else he wasn't quite ready to name. "Tell me about yourself," he said, surprising himself with the request. "Beyond this mystery, who is Victoria Marlowe when she's not fleeing from shadows and searching for hidden documents?" Victoria smiled, a real smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. "I'm someone who loves art and history, who spent 2 glorious years wandering through museums and galleries in Europe. I'm someone who believes that understanding the past is the key to building a better future. I'm someone who was very happy in Rome but came home because family duty called, and now finds herself in the middle of something she doesn't fully understand. And what do you want? After all this is resolved, what life do you envision for yourself?" The question was intimate, far more personal than their brief acquaintance warranted, but somehow it felt right to ask it. Victoria considered carefully before answering. "I want to continue my uncle's work in a way. Not just collecting documents, but making them accessible to people, helping them understand their own history. I want to establish a proper archive, perhaps even a small museum. And I want—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "I want a life that matters. Not just society balls and afternoon teas. I want purpose." "You shall have it," Alexander said with quiet conviction. "I give you my word." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, something shifted between them. What had begun as a professional arrangement was becoming something more, something neither had anticipated but both recognized. There was a connection forming, delicate and new, but with the potential to grow into something profound. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the front door. Alexander was on his feet instantly, his body tensed for action. "Stay here," he commanded quietly, moving toward the entrance hall. Through the drawing room doorway, Victoria could hear low voices, Alexander's deep tones and another man's voice, higher and more agitated. After a moment, Alexander returned with a visitor, a young man, perhaps 25, with sandy hair and anxious blue eyes. His clothes were well made but disheveled, and he was breathing hard as though he had been running. "Miss Marlowe," Alexander said grimly, "this is Thomas Whitfield, junior partner at his father's law firm. He says he has urgent information about your uncle's death, information that couldn't wait until morning." Thomas Whitfield nodded rapidly, his eyes darting between them. "Miss Marlowe, forgive the intrusion at this late hour, but I had to find you. I've been searching all evening. You're in terrible danger, and I fear I'm partly responsible." Victoria rose from her chair, alarm written across her features. "What do you mean? What's happened?" Thomas took a deep breath, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. "My father, Josiah Whitfield, was your uncle's lawyer and friend for over 30 years. When Mr. Marlowe died, my father handled his estate. But there's something you don't know. Something my father swore me to secrecy about. I've wrestled with my conscience these past weeks, and I can no longer remain silent. Speak plainly, man, Alexander said sharply. What secret? 3 days before your uncle died, he came to our office in a state of great agitation. He had made a new will, one that superseded all previous versions. In it, he left specific instructions about certain documents. Documents, he said, were more valuable than his entire estate combined. He gave my father a sealed envelope and made him swear that it would only be opened if something happened to him, and then only in the presence of Miss Marlowe herself. Victoria's hand went to her throat. Where is this envelope now? Thomas's face darkened. That's just it. It's gone. 3 nights ago, our office was broken into. Nothing was taken except that envelope from my father's personal safe. The thieves knew exactly where to look, exactly what they wanted. My father reported it to the police as a simple burglary, but I know better. Miss Marlowe, someone killed your uncle for those documents, and now they've stolen the only clue to their location. And I fear, he swallowed hard, I fear my father may be in league with them. The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Victoria sank back into her chair, her face pale with shock, while Alexander's expression hardened into something dangerous and determined. Thomas Whitfield stood before them, trembling with the weight of his betrayal of his own father, yet clearly convinced of the righteousness of his decision. Those are serious allegations against your father, Alexander said coldly. You understand what you're suggesting? That Josiah Whitfield, one of Boston's most respected attorneys, is involved in murder and theft? I know what it sounds like, Thomas replied miserably. I've barely slept since that night. But you must understand, there have been signs, things that didn't add up. After the break-in, my father seemed almost relieved, rather than distressed. He forbade me from mentioning the stolen envelope to anyone, especially Miss Marlowe. He said it would only upset her unnecessarily, that it probably contained nothing of importance. But I saw his face when Mr. Marlowe first gave him that envelope. He was frightened, Mr. Thorne, truly frightened. And now he meets with strange men at odd hours, men who don't look like our usual clients. Rough men, dangerous men. Victoria found her voice, though it shook with emotion. My uncle trusted your father completely. They were friends for decades. How could he betray him so terribly? I don't believe my father meant for Mr. Marlowe to die, Thomas said quickly. I think he was approached by these men, pressured somehow. Perhaps they threatened him or offered him money. I don't know. But I believe he told them about the envelope, about what Mr. Marlowe had discovered. And when your uncle wouldn't cooperate, when he wouldn't reveal where he'd hidden the documents, they killed him and made it look like an accident. Alexander began pacing the room, his mind racing through the implications. The night of the break-in, was there any sign of forced entry? None. That's what troubled me most. Whoever opened that safe knew the combination. Only my father and I have it. And you're certain you didn't leave it open? Didn't write the combination down somewhere it could be found? Thomas's face flushed with indignation. I'm not a fool, Mr. Thorne. I've been trained in the law since I was old enough to read. I know the value of discretion and security. No, someone who knew that combination opened that safe. And if it wasn't me, then it was my father. Or someone your father told. Victoria interjected softly. Both men turned to look at her. Forgive me, Mr. Whitfield, but if your father is being coerced as you suggest, mightn't he have been forced to reveal the combination? Perhaps he didn't willingly betray my uncle. Perhaps he had no choice. Thomas considered this, a flicker of hope crossing his anguished features. I hadn't thought of that. You're very generous, Miss Marlowe. More generous than I deserve for keeping silent this long. Alexander stopped his pacing and faced Thomas squarely. This envelope your father received, did your uncle give any indication of its contents? Any hint at all? Only that it contained instructions for finding what he called the truth of our founding. My father tried to convince him to reveal more, to let him help protect these documents. But Mr. Marlowe refused. He said the fewer people who knew, the safer everyone would be. He said he'd found something that would shake the halls of power, and that there were men in high positions who would stop at nothing to keep it secret. High positions, Alexander repeated thoughtfully. Did he name anyone specifically? Any government officials, politicians, business leaders? Not in my hearing, but my father grew very pale when Mr. Marlowe mentioned that men in Washington were involved, That the conspiracy reached all the way to... Thomas hesitated, as though the words themselves were dangerous. To where? Alexander pressed. You must tell us everything, Mr. Whitfield. To the very highest levels of government. That's what Mr. Marlowe said. All the way to the marble halls where laws are made and presidents are crowned. Those were his exact words. I remember them because they frightened me. Victoria's hand had gone to her throat again, her eyes wide. What could my uncle possibly have discovered that would warrant such attention? What secret could be so dangerous? Alexander moved to his desk and began sorting through papers and books, pulling down a heavy volume on American history. Your uncle mentioned a secret pact made during the Revolutionary War. Let me think. 1778, you said? That was a pivotal year. The war was going badly for the Continental Army. They were desperate, low on supplies, losing battles. France had just entered the war on our side. But that alliance came with strings attached, with promises made. He looked up suddenly, his gray eyes sharp. Miss Marlowe, did your uncle ever speak to you about the Treaty of Alliance with France? About the negotiations that took place? Only in general terms. He said that Franklin and the others made concessions that troubled them, that they essentially mortgaged America's future to secure French aid in the present. Yes, that much is known to historians. But what if there was more? What if there were secret provisions? Promises made that were never meant to become public. Promises that would embarrass powerful families. Families whose wealth and position today rest on foundations laid during the Revolution. Thomas nodded eagerly. That would explain everything. If these documents prove that certain prominent families, families with seats in Congress, families that control banks and railroads and newspapers, if these documents prove that their fortunes were built on treason or betrayal during the war, they would indeed kill to keep that secret buried. But where would my uncle hide such explosive documents? Victoria asked desperately. We're no closer to finding them than we were before. Alexander returned to his chair, leaning forward intently. We need to think as your uncle thought. He was a historian, methodical and careful. He would hide them somewhere significant, somewhere connected to the very history they represent. The midnight convocation, that secret meeting in 1778. What if it wasn't just a story he told you as a child? What if it was real? And what if he hid the documents at or near the location where that meeting took place? But he said the tavern was torn down decades ago. The building may be gone, but the location remains. And if your uncle discovered where it was, he might have hidden the documents nearby, in some place that echoed the original hiding place. Think, Victoria. Alexander used her given name unconsciously, his urgency overriding formality. Did he ever take you anywhere special in Boston? Anywhere he seemed particularly attached to? Victoria closed her eyes, sifting through memories. Images flashed through her mind, walking hand in hand with her uncle through the cobblestone streets of old Boston, listening to his stories, watching his face light up with passion as he spoke of the past. And then, suddenly, a memory crystallized with perfect clarity. The Old North Church, she said, opening her eyes. He took me there often when I was a child. He would stand in the cemetery beside it, among the old graves, and he would say that beneath our feet lay the bones of those who had shaped our nation. He said that their secrets were buried with them, but that sometimes, if you listened carefully, you could still hear them whispering truth to those brave enough to hear. Alexander was on his feet instantly. The cemetery. Of course. What better place to hide documents about the dead than among the dead themselves? Thomas, you said your father has been meeting with dangerous men. Do you know where these meetings take place? At the docks, usually. The old merchants' wharf warehouses. I followed him once, though I stayed well back. I saw him meet with 3 men. Rough types, as I said. They argued about something, though I couldn't hear the words. But at the end, my father handed one of them what looked like a map or a diagram. A map, Alexander repeated grimly. A map to the Old North Church Cemetery, perhaps. They may already know where to look. We need to move now, tonight, before they can get there first. But it's nearly midnight, Victoria protested. The church will be locked, the cemetery dark and treacherous in this storm. All the better for what we need to do. Miss Marlowe, Victoria, I won't pretend this won't be dangerous. These men have already killed once, and they won't hesitate to kill again. You can stay here, where it's safe. Mrs. Fletcher will look after you. Victoria stood, her chin raised defiantly, her green eyes flashing with determination. My uncle left those documents for me to find. He trusted me with this responsibility. I will not hide while others risk themselves on my behalf. I'm coming with you, Alexander, and I'll hear no argument about it. Alexander looked at her standing there, wet and bedraggled, yet somehow magnificent in her courage and conviction, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. This was no delicate flower to be protected and coddled. This was a woman of substance, of strength, and he found himself admiring her more with each passing moment. "Very well," he said softly. "We go together, but you must promise me you'll do exactly as I say if we encounter danger." "I promise." "Then we need to arm ourselves and prepare." Alexander moved to a cabinet and withdrew 2 pistols, gleaming Colt revolvers, well-maintained and loaded. He handed one to Thomas. "Do you know how to use this? My father taught me to shoot as a boy. I'm no expert, but I can handle myself." "Good. Victoria, can you shoot?" She surprised him by nodding. "My uncle insisted I learn when I came of age. He said a woman traveling alone, even in civilized Europe, should know how to defend herself. I'm quite a good shot, actually." Alexander smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "You continue to amaze me." "Very well." He handed her the 2nd pistol, then retrieved a 3rd for himself from the cabinet, along with a dark lantern and a small spade. "If we're right about the cemetery, we may need to do some digging." Within 10 minutes they were ready. Mrs. Fletcher had been roused and informed in vague terms that Mr. Thorne was going out on urgent business. She clucked her disapproval but helped Victoria into a more practical coat and sturdy boots, better suited for skulking around cemeteries in the rain than her elegant traveling dress. They left through the back entrance of the townhouse, moving quickly through the rain-slicked streets. Alexander led them on a circuitous route, doubling back several times to ensure they weren't followed. The storm had intensified, the rain coming down in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards, which was both a blessing and a curse. They were harder to spot, but so were any potential enemies. The Old North Church loomed before them at last, its white steeple barely visible against the dark, roiling clouds. The cemetery beside it was a maze of tilted headstones and weathered monuments, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and the elements. In the darkness and rain, it looked like something from a Gothic novel, eerie and forbidding. "Stay close," Alexander whispered, lighting the dark lantern and keeping its beam low. "Victoria, where did your uncle usually take you? Which part of the cemetery was he most drawn to?" Victoria moved forward confidently despite the darkness, her feet finding familiar paths even after years away. "The oldest section, in the back corner. There's a large monument there, a weeping angel marking the grave of someone named Pembroke. Uncle Edmund said it was erected in 1779, right after the end of the war, and that Pembroke had been one of the unsung heroes of the Revolution." They made their way carefully between the graves, Thomas bringing up the rear and keeping watch behind them. The wind howled through the cemetery, making the bare tree branches clatter like bones. Rain streamed down their faces, cold and relentless. And then Victoria stopped abruptly. "There," she said, pointing. "The weeping angel." The monument was larger than Alexander had expected, nearly 6 feet tall, depicting an angel with her face covered by her hands in eternal grief. At her feet was a stone plaque with an inscription, barely legible in the dim light of the lantern. "Here lies Colonel James Pembroke, 1730-1779. His sacrifice shall not be forgotten." "His sacrifice," Alexander murmured. "What sacrifice, I wonder?" He knelt beside the monument, running his hands over the stone, feeling for any irregularity, any sign of tampering. "Help me look. There must be something here, some indication of where—" "Mr. Thorne," Thomas's urgent whisper cut through the rain. "Someone's coming. Multiple people, approaching from the church." Alexander doused the lantern instantly, plunging them into darkness. "Behind the monument, quickly!" They pressed themselves against the back of the weeping angel, hearts pounding as they heard voices approaching through the storm. 3 men, perhaps 4, their words carried on the wind in fragments. "Must be here somewhere." The old man's notes said, "Find it before that meddling detective." The voices grew closer, and then Alexander saw them. 4 shadowy figures carrying lanterns, moving systematically through the cemetery. One of them was older, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. Even in the darkness and rain, Alexander recognized the bearing, the posture of authority and respectability. "Father," Thomas breathed beside Alexander, his voice barely audible but filled with anguish. There was no mistaking it now. Josiah Whitfield was indeed among the men searching the cemetery, his distinguished profile unmistakable even in the dim glow of the lanterns. Alexander placed a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder, a silent command to remain still and quiet. Victoria pressed closer to both of them, her breathing shallow, the pistol gripped tightly in her gloved hand. They watched as the four men spread out among the graves, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows across the weathered headstones. Pembroke's monument should be in this section. Josiah Whitfield's cultured voice carried clearly despite the rain. According to Marlowe's research notes, this is where he believed the original cache was placed. Spread out and search carefully. The mechanism will be subtle. Pembroke was clever, and those who came after him were equally so. One of the other men, a burly figure with a scarred face, growled impatiently, "We've been searching for weeks, Mr. Whitfield. Maybe the old man was wrong. Maybe there's nothing here but dead men's bones." "Edmund Marlowe was never wrong about historical matters," Josiah replied sharply. "He spent 40 years piecing this mystery together. The documents are here, somewhere beneath our feet, and we will find them tonight. Mr. Blackwell has made it abundantly clear that failure is not an option." "Blackwell," Alexander mouthed silently to Victoria, committing the name to memory. This was the man pulling the strings, the one powerful enough to orchestrate murder and corruption. The searchers were drawing closer to the Weeping Angel monument. Alexander could see them examining each grave marker, testing stones, probing the muddy ground with metal rods. In moments they would be upon them. He had to make a decision, wait and hope they weren't discovered, or act first while they still had the element of surprise. But Victoria made the decision for all of them. While the men were still several yards away, she suddenly shifted position, and her foot struck something metallic half buried in the mud at the base of the monument. The sound was small but distinct, a hollow clang that spoke of something artificial beneath the earth. Alexander's eyes widened. He dropped to his knees instantly, his hands scrabbling in the mud, feeling for what Victoria had found. His fingers closed around cold iron, a ring set flush into a stone slab that had been cunningly concealed beneath centuries of accumulated soil and grass. "Here," he whispered urgently. "Thomas, help me." Together they grasped the iron ring and pulled. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound that seemed impossibly loud in the storm, the stone slab shifted, revealing a dark opening beneath, a hollow space in the earth lined with old brick. What was that? One of the searchers shouted. "Over there, by the angel! Move!" Alexander commanded. He thrust his hand into the opening and felt something wrapped in oilcloth. He grabbed it without hesitation, pulled it free, and shoved it into Victoria's hands. "Run! Back to the street now!" They broke from their hiding place just as the four men converged on the monument. Josiah Whitfield's face registered shock as he recognized his son among the fleeing figures. "Thomas, no! What have you done?" But there was no time for explanations or recriminations. Alexander led Victoria and Thomas in a desperate sprint through the cemetery, weaving between headstones as shouts erupted behind them. A shot rang out, the bullet striking a stone angel with a sharp crack, sending chips of marble flying. "They're shooting at us!" Victoria gasped, but she kept pace with Alexander, her skirts hiked up in one hand, the precious oilcloth package clutched against her chest with the other. Another shot, closer this time. Alexander spun and returned fire, not aiming to kill but to slow their pursuers. The burly man with the scarred face dove behind a monument, cursing. It bought them precious seconds. They reached the cemetery gate and burst through onto the street. A hansom cab was passing, whether by providence or pure chance. Alexander didn't question it. He flagged it down with his pistol still in hand, and the driver, eyes wide with alarm, nevertheless stopped. "Drive," Alexander shouted, practically throwing Victoria into the cab before leaping in after her, with Thomas scrambling in behind. "The harbor, as fast as your horse can manage, and there's $50 in it for you." The driver needed no further encouragement. He cracked his whip and the cab lurched forward, the horse's hooves clattering frantically on the wet cobblestones. Behind them, Alexander could see their pursuers emerging from the cemetery, but they had no vehicle near enough to give chase. For the moment, they had escaped. Inside the cab, the three of them sat in stunned silence, breathing heavily, rain dripping from their clothes and hair. Victoria still clutched the oilcloth package, her hands trembling. Thomas looked shell-shocked, having just seen his father revealed as a conspirator in murder and theft. "Let me see it," Alexander said gently, reaching for the package. Victoria handed it over with shaking hands. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, revealing a leather document case, old but well preserved, sealed with wax that bore an insignia Alexander recognized, the personal seal of Benjamin Franklin. "My God," Thomas breathed. "Is that genuine?" "It appears to be." Alexander's hands were steady as he broke the seal and opened the case. Inside were several documents, their paper yellowed with age, but the writing still clear and legible. He held them up to the light of the cab's small interior lamp and began to read. What he saw made his blood run cold. These were letters, correspondence between Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and several other founding fathers, dated from 1778 and 1779. But more damning still were letters from British negotiators and French officials, all detailing a secret agreement that had been struck during the darkest days of the Revolutionary War. "Victoria," Alexander said slowly, "your uncle was right to be frightened. These documents prove that certain prominent American families that are powerful to this day, secretly collaborated with both the British and the French during the war. They played all sides, ensuring that no matter who won, they would come out ahead. They betrayed the revolution for profit and power." "But the revolution succeeded," Victoria said, confused. "America won its independence." "Yes, but at what cost?" According to these letters, in exchange for their assistance in securing French aid and financing the war effort, these families were promised exclusive trade rights, land grants, and political influence that would last for generations. They essentially bought their way into the new American aristocracy through what amounts to treason. And their descendants, men who now sit in Congress, who control banks and railroads, who shape policy, they're the ones trying to keep this secret buried. Thomas leaned forward, his face ashen. "Blackwell. Samuel Blackwell. He's descended from one of the families named in those documents, isn't he? The Blackwell shipping fortune, the Blackwell Bank. It's all built on betrayal." Alexander nodded grimly. "And he's not alone. I recognize several other names here. Prominent families, powerful men who would stop at nothing to prevent this information from becoming public. Your uncle stumbled onto the greatest conspiracy in American history, Victoria. No wonder they killed him." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Then we must make sure his death wasn't in vain. These documents must be made public. The truth must come out no matter the cost." "It will be dangerous," Alexander warned. "These men have already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets. If we move forward with this, we'll be painting targets on our backs." "I don't care," Victoria said fiercely. "My uncle dedicated his life to the truth. I won't let his killers win. I won't let them bury the truth along with him." Alexander looked at her in the flickering lamplight, saw the determination in her green eyes, the courage that blazed there despite her fear, and felt his heart swell with an emotion he had sworn never to feel again. He had loved once, years ago, and lost her to illness. He had buried his heart with her, or so he had thought. But Victoria Marlowe was awakening something in him, something he had believed long dead. "Then we do this together," he said softly. "All three of us. But we must be smart about it. We need to get these documents to someone beyond Blackwell's reach, someone with the power and the integrity to ensure they reach the public eye." "Who?" Thomas asked. "Everyone in Boston seems to be either under Blackwell's control or too frightened to oppose him." Alexander was silent for a moment, thinking rapidly. Then his face cleared. "Senator Morrison. He's in Washington, but he's known for his incorruptibility. He's made enemies in high places precisely because he refuses to be bought or intimidated. If we can get these documents to him, he'll know what to do with them. Washington is a day's journey by train," Victoria pointed out. "Can we make it there before Blackwell realizes where we've gone?" "We leave tonight. The late train departs at 2 in the morning from South Station. We have just enough time to stop at my townhouse, gather a few necessities, and make it to the station." Alexander looked at Thomas. "You understand what this means? If you come with us, you're burning every bridge. Your father, your position at the law firm, your entire future in Boston, all of it will be gone." Thomas's jaw set firmly. "My father made his choice. Now I'm making mine. I choose the truth, and I choose to stand with Miss Marlowe and see this through to the end." The cab pulled up at Alexander's townhouse, and they hurried inside, dripping rain across Mrs. Fletcher's clean floors. The housekeeper took one look at their disheveled, desperate state and asked no questions, simply bustling about to help them prepare for immediate departure. Within 20 minutes, Alexander had packed a traveling bag with the documents secured in a locked case, along with his pistols, ammunition, and enough money to see them through several days if necessary. Victoria changed into dry clothes borrowed from Mrs. Fletcher's niece, who was close to her size, a practical traveling suit of dark brown wool. Thomas sent a brief note to his rooms, arranging for his things to be sent on later. As they prepared to leave, Alexander pulled Victoria aside in the entrance hall, away from the others. Rain still beat against the windows, and the house felt like a small island of warmth and safety in a hostile world. He knew this might be his only chance to speak to her alone, to say what had been building in his heart since the moment she walked into that café. "Victoria," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "Before we do this, before we step into danger from which we may not emerge unscathed, I need to tell you something." She looked up at him, her green eyes questioning in the dim light of the entrance hall. "What is it, Alexander?" "I've spent years of my life solving mysteries, helping strangers, keeping myself separate from emotional entanglements because I believed that was the only way to do my work effectively. But tonight, watching you face danger with such courage, listening to you speak about your uncle and your determination to honor his memory, I've realized something. I've realized that I've been only half alive, going through the motions of living without truly feeling." He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You've awakened something in me, Victoria. Something I thought lost forever. I don't know what the future holds, or if we'll even survive the next few days, but I needed you to know that meeting you has changed me. You've changed me." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. She had felt it too, this connection between them, this sense that they were meant to find each other in the midst of chaos and danger. It terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. "Alexander," she whispered, "I feel it too. From the moment I saw you in that café, something in me recognized something in you. I don't know what this is between us, or where it might lead, but I know that I don't want to face what's coming without you by my side." He raised her hand to his lips, kissing it with a gentleness that made her knees weak. "Then we face it together, whatever comes. And I give you my word, Victoria Marlowe. I will protect you with my life, and I will see this through to the end. Your uncle will have justice. The truth will be told, and when this is all over—" He paused, his gray eyes searching hers. "When this is all over, if you'll permit me, I would very much like to know you better, to see if what we both feel in this moment can grow into something lasting. I would like that very much," Victoria said softly. And then, acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand but trusted completely, she rose on her toes and kissed him gently on the cheek. It was a chaste kiss, proper and restrained, but it carried with it a promise of more to come, of a future they would build together once the darkness had passed. Alexander's hand came up to cup her face tenderly, and for a moment they simply stood there, looking at each other, memorizing each other's features, as though this moment might have to sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. "We should go," Thomas said quietly from the doorway, tactfully giving them a moment more before intruding. "The train won't wait, and neither will Blackwell's men once they realize we've escaped." The journey to South Station was tense, all three of them watching the rain-swept streets for any sign of pursuit. But they reached the station without incident and boarded the Washington train just as it was preparing to depart. Alexander secured them a private compartment, using his wealth and influence to ensure their privacy and safety during the journey ahead. As the train pulled out of Boston, steaming south through the storm-tossed night, Alexander sat beside Victoria, their shoulders touching, the precious documents secure in the locked case at their feet. Thomas dozed fitfully in the seat across from them, exhausted by the night's events and the emotional turmoil of betraying his father for a greater cause. "Do you think we'll succeed?" Victoria asked quietly, watching the darkness stream past the window. "I think we have truth on our side," Alexander replied, "and that's a powerful weapon. But more than that, we have each other, and together, I believe we can face anything." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the warmth that radiated from his presence. "Tell me about your life, Alexander. I want to know everything about you. We have hours until we reach Washington. Help me understand the man who's risking everything to help me." And so, as the train carried them through the night toward an uncertain future, Alexander told her his story. He spoke of his childhood, of parents who had taught him the value of justice and compassion despite their wealth. He told her of the woman he had loved and lost, the grief that had driven him to become a detective, seeking truth in a world that often seemed built on lies. He spoke of cases he had solved, of people he had helped, of the satisfaction that came from bringing light into darkness. In turn, Victoria shared her own story, her childhood with her uncle, her years in Europe, her passion for art and history, her dreams of building something meaningful with her life. They talked as though they had known each other for years rather than mere hours, their words flowing easily, naturally, building bridges between their souls. As dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, painting the storm clouds with shades of pink and gold, the train pulled into Washington Station. They had arrived, weary but determined, ready to face whatever awaited them. Senator Morrison's residence was an elegant townhouse in the heart of the capital, and the senator himself, a stern-faced man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and keen blue eyes, received them in his study within an hour of their arrival. Alexander had sent word ahead by telegram from a station stop, and the senator had agreed to see them immediately, intrigued by Alexander's cryptic message about documents of national importance. When Alexander laid the leather case on the senator's desk and revealed its contents, Morrison's face went through a series of transformations: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally grim determination. He spent an hour reading through every document, occasionally asking sharp questions that proved he understood both the historical significance and the contemporary implications of what he was seeing. "These are authentic," he said at last, looking up at the three young people standing before him. "I would stake my reputation on it. The handwriting, the seals, the paper itself, all genuine. Miss Marlowe, your uncle has handed us the means to shake the foundations of power in this nation. There will be investigations, trials, scandals that will rock Washington and Boston both. Powerful men will fall, and they will not go quietly. Will you do it?" Victoria asked, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "Will you ensure these documents reach the public?" Morrison stood, his bearing that of a man who had spent decades fighting battles in the halls of power. "I will. I'll present these to Congress myself, and I'll make sure they're published in every major newspaper in the nation. The truth will come out, Miss Marlowe. Your uncle's death will not be in vain." He paused, then added quietly, "But you must understand, you'll need protection. Blackwell and his associates won't give up simply because we've exposed them. They'll want revenge, and they have long memories. I can provide protection," Alexander said firmly. "And I have resources and connections that can help keep Miss Marlowe safe until the trials are concluded and these men are behind bars where they belong." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. I'll assign federal marshals as well, just to be certain. Mr. Whitfield, I'll need your testimony about your father's involvement. It won't be easy, testifying against your own blood, but it's necessary if we're to see justice done." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "I understand, Senator. I'm prepared to do whatever is necessary. My father made his choices. I've made mine." The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Senator Morrison moved swiftly. The documents were authenticated by historical experts and presented to Congress. Newspapers across the nation ran headlines about the scandal, about the conspiracy that had been hidden for over a century. Samuel Blackwell and half a dozen other prominent men were arrested, along with Josiah Whitfield, whose involvement in Edmund Marlowe's murder was proven through Thomas's testimony and evidence gathered by federal investigators. Throughout it all, Alexander remained by Victoria's side, protecting her from threats both physical and legal. They stayed in a safe house arranged by Senator Morrison, with federal marshals stationed outside. But the danger, while real, seemed distant compared to what was growing between them. In the quiet evenings, after days spent giving testimony and meeting with lawyers, they would sit together and talk about the future. Alexander spoke of continuing his detective work, but with Victoria as his partner. Her knowledge of history and her sharp mind would make her invaluable in solving cases involving historical mysteries and document fraud. Victoria spoke of her dream of establishing an archive and museum, and Alexander pledged his financial support to make it a reality. And slowly, carefully, their relationship deepened. Stolen moments became something more. A kiss in the garden at twilight, hands held under the dinner table, quiet conversations that lasted until dawn. They were falling in love, genuinely and completely. bound together not just by the danger they had faced, but by a profound recognition that they had found in each other something rare and precious. 3 months after that stormy night in Boston, the trials concluded. Samuel Blackwell and his co-conspirators were convicted of conspiracy, murder, and a host of other crimes. Josiah Whitfield, in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, received a reduced sentence. Thomas, though grief-stricken by his father's fall, found solace in knowing he had chosen the right path. On a warm June evening, as the sun set over Boston Harbor, Alexander and Victoria stood together on the balcony of her uncle's house on Commonwealth Avenue, her house now, left to her along with his entire estate and collection. They had spent the day making plans for the Edmund Marlowe Archive and Historical Society, which would open its doors the following year. "Are you happy?" Alexander asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close. Victoria leaned against him, watching the golden light play across the water. "I am. My uncle has justice. The truth is known, and I have you. I have everything I could have hoped for and more." Alexander turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his gray eyes full of love and tenderness. "Victoria Marlowe, I have loved you from the moment you walked into that café and into my life. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me spend the rest of my life solving mysteries with you, building dreams with you, loving you with everything I am?" Tears of joy streamed down Victoria's face as she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, Alexander, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Victoria laughed, a sound of pure happiness that seemed to echo out across the harbor and into the gathering twilight. "We've had quite an adventure, haven't we?" she said, her forehead resting against his. "The greatest adventure of my life," Alexander agreed, "and it's only just beginning." They were married that autumn in a small ceremony at the Old North Church, with Thomas serving as Alexander's best man, and Grace, the observant waitress from the Westbrook Café, standing up as Victoria's attendant. Senator Morrison attended, as did Mrs. Fletcher and dozens of others whose lives had been touched by the revelation of the truth and by the courage of two people who had refused to let that truth remain buried. As Alexander and Victoria exchanged their vows in the shadow of that historic church, with its cemetery holding the secrets they had uncovered, they both felt the presence of Edmund Marlowe, watching over them with approval and pride. His death had not been in vain. From tragedy had come truth, and from danger had come a love that would last a lifetime. They spent their honeymoon in Europe, retracing Victoria's steps through the museums and galleries of Paris and Rome, but this time with Alexander at her side, sharing her joy in art and beauty. When they returned to Boston, it was to begin their new life together, he continuing his detective work with her as his full partner, she building the archive her uncle had dreamed of, both of them solving mysteries and seeking truth side by side. Years later, when people asked them how they had met, they would smile at each other and speak of a rainy afternoon in a café, of a mysterious note passed by a watchful waitress, of danger faced and overcome together. But what they never spoke of, what they kept close to their hearts as a precious secret, was the moment they had looked into each other's eyes for the first time and known, with absolute certainty, that they had found their perfect match, their partner, their love, their forever. The Marlowe documents, as they came to be known, changed American historiography forever. They opened up new lines of inquiry into the Revolutionary period and forced a more nuanced understanding of how the nation had been founded, not through the actions of saints and heroes alone, but through the complicated choices of flawed human beings navigating impossible circumstances. Edmund Marlowe's life's work had, in the end, achieved exactly what he had hoped. It had brought truth to light, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be. And in the home that Alexander and Victoria made together, in the archive that bore Edmund's name, in the children they would one day raise with a love of history and a commitment to truth, his legacy lived on. The millionaire detective and the historian's niece had found each other in the midst of conspiracy and danger, and from that chance meeting in a café on a rainy Boston afternoon, they had built a life of purpose, passion, and enduring love. The message that Grace had slipped to Alexander that day, "Someone followed you inside. Stay calm," had been the first step on a journey neither of them could have imagined. It had led them through danger and discovery, through fear and courage, and ultimately to each other. And as they stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the future that stretched before them bright with possibility. They knew that every moment of danger, every challenge they had faced, had been worth it for the gift of finding a love that would last forever.